Sure, I'm very nervous.
You're very nervous. What are you nervous about?
Recording a fight with my girlfriend.
Hi, I'm Joel.
And I'm Andrea.
Welcome to Life, right?
Every week, we share stories about things that we all experience but don't really talk about.
If you listened last week, thanks for coming back. If you're new, thanks for joining us. We definitely recommend checking out last week's episode, if you haven't, where we talk about identity. We also talk about the identity of this show, who we are, where we're coming from, and where we want to go with the show. So check it out. Life Right is supported by a generous grant from the United Church of Canada and is produced out of the offices of Lynn Valley United Church in North Vancouver, British Columbia. For more information, go to lynnvalleychurch.com.
Since the show is new, we're still kind of testing things out a bit. We want to try some different formats, so this week we're doing something kind of different. Last week we talked to a couple people separately. This week we want to talk to two people together in a conversation. So why don't you introduce our guest today, Joel?
Yeah, the guests are Essex, your boyfriend, and you, Andrea.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we figure that since through this show we're asking other people to be honest about tough things, we should be willing to be honest about tough things ourselves. In this episode, you're going to hear these two discuss their seemingly widely differing spiritual worldviews. For a bit of context, Essex is a computer scientist about to defend his PhD. He grew up with an atheistic worldview. Andrea is an arts creator and administrator who grew up in a Mennonite family. You ready for this, Andrea?
Odd couple, jazz hands.
Life, right? So I'll set the scene for you a little bit. We all met at Essex's dining room table.
Not all of our past spiritual-related conversations have gone particularly well.
I feel like most of them have.
All of our past spiritual conversations have gone particularly not well.
I asked the both of them to give me an overview of what they believe the other's spiritual worldview to be.
I find your beliefs confusing and difficult to remember because they're confusing to me. So Andrea believes in some sort of spiritual thing. Seems open to the idea, but a little uncertain about a godlike being. She definitely believes in a spiritual component to the universe, although saying it that way restricts the spiritual component to be part of the universe rather than the universe being part of a larger spiritual thing. So that's my mistake there. She believes in energy, which I haven't been able to figure out quite what that means, but everyone seems to have a generally sort of agreed upon sense of what that is, and the soul, and is very, very open to things. Open to being extremely uncertain about whether or not ideas are true. Things like, well, we talked about spiritual healing, but I imagine you're probably relatively open to things like astral projection or, to some degree, psychics. She does not identify as Christian, but goes to a Christian church. Reason being that she thinks there's many ways to connect with the spirit, whatever it is, and that church helps her do that, even if she doesn't agree with everything they say about Jesus or whatever.
I do have a confusing belief structure, but it's pretty good.
It'd be much easier if you were just, like, Catholic.
Yes, I know.
Like a nice pre-organized system of beliefs that a bunch of people subscribe to and written down in a book.
Yeah, I know, but I made it really complicated.
Yeah.
I have a hard time explaining it,
Yeah.
so he did a pretty decent job. I don't necessarily think that, I do see a spiritual component to life, certainly, and some kind of greater whatever the energetic force or God or whatever it was that brought existence into being. Like, I think that's a thing, whether it is just energy, not in the airy-fairy, new agey way, but like actual scientific energy components. I don't know science that well, but whether it was that or it's some actual intelligent God figure, I don't know. That's the thing. I think it's quite possible that everything that we label as spiritual or supernatural has a super concrete scientific explanation, but we just have no idea how to measure. Like, that's just completely beyond us. Like, there are mysteries in the universe that could be God, whatever you want to define that as, or they could be just this X plus Y equals Z thing that we just haven't, we have no instruments to observe on that level yet. But I think calling it God is not only fine, but kind of nice and helpful to life. I think Essex believes only in the physical reality that we have measured with scientific means. That we basically know what's going on in the universe. There's no mysteries or miracles or things that are kind of beyond what we've already sussed out. Not that we know everything, but we kind of know everything there is to know.
I felt like you exaggerated my confidence in science's understanding of everything. Like, I certainly think that there's a ton of stuff we don't know. We know there's a ton of stuff we don't know because we have inconsistent equations. So even the things we think we know are contradictory. So therefore obviously wrong. Because I think the universe is consistent. It'd be very confusing if it wasn't consistent. Another very minor technical point about your comment about my beliefs was something along the lines of there not being anything outside of this universe. I have no idea. There very well could be. In the context you were saying, you were sort of talking about greater as a sort of intentional greater. There could certainly be greater as in just like bigger. It could be another universe over to the left. And it's greater in some sense in that now it's bigger. Because it's two.
Mm-hmm. What about something that houses our universe and maybe all the universes? If there are multiples.
Like a bowl of universes?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. Everything we call the universe could be some bubble in some corner of another thing. There's certainly theories like that are mathy and look reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Not that that's a prerequisite for something being a fair idea. You don't have to have a nice consistent theory and a bunch of papers in order for something to be reasonable. Especially when you're talking about things that we completely can't even in theory ever interact with or observe, like things outside the universe.
See, but I feel like with these kinds of conversations, you do think that it has to be sort of mathy and supported by papers and research to be reasonable.
Yeah, that's fair. You can start out without a bunch of math and physics, but if you're serious about this model being any good, at some point you have to write down the math.
But why?
Because otherwise, how do you know if it even makes sense?
Why does the model for how we could understand the universe have to make sense in a math way?
'Cause math is the language of the universe.
But this is all just, it's for, like, it makes no difference to the universe how we think the universe works.
Agreed. Well, probably, but agreed.
Okay, probably.
I sometimes worry about that too.
What, that the universe is worried about us thinking that the universe understands
That the rules of the universe are just continually being made up by us and it changes to be whatever we think it is. Never retroactively changing anything we've observed, but every time we make a new observation about physics we haven't previously observed, what if it just chooses something new? Or chooses to be whatever we're thinking it will be?
See, and this doesn't this sound like something spiritual? Like what people think happens when they pray to God and they think that God does what they want him to do.
Yeah, kind of. I think it's exceptionally unlikely.
Well, I think it's unlikely that we ask God to do things and then he does them. But
But
that
also,
doesn't
it's kinda
discount the
bothered me.
value of prayer.
Earlier in the evening, Essex had shared that one of his favorite things in the world was to go out hiking in nature. I asked him if he equated that with a spiritual experience.
So I like feeling connected to nature. I will like touch the trees while I walk by, or take off my shoes and socks. I can't say that it's a spiritual experience for me, but maybe I just don't know what a spiritual experience feels like, and it is. Maybe I just use different words than everyone else.
See, I think that's part of it. Because what you describe when you talk about it, to me, that's a spiritual experience. That feeling of connection, the feeling of like openness and all that stuff. I feel like you just refuse to acknowledge spiritual, and so you refuse to call it spiritual. But maybe it's what you just said, but that's my more maybe negative putting on, whereas you just said maybe you just don't, I don't know what you just said, you don't know what a spiritual experience is or something like that.
One of the reasons I'm reluctant to call this a spiritual experience is that in my mind, spiritual experiences involve some sort of supernatural component, and I don't think there's a supernatural component. I don't think there's anything going on in my enjoying the outdoors that isn't just happening in my own brain.
I don't think
Okay.
that you have to attribute nature to God or something like that to have a spiritual experience in nature. But a spiritual experience definitely is part of feeling connected. I think feeling more connected to yourself and to others is like a spiritual experience. But there is also a component, so there's that, but there's also the feeling of connection to something bigger than yourself, and whether that's God or nature or, you know, just like the forces of nature that are so much greater than human minds will ever comprehend, or whatever it is. A feeling of connection to something bigger than you. But ultimately, I think spiritual connection is the root of a spiritual experience. So I don't think it presupposes God in the traditional sense of what God would be. But it does presuppose that you have a spirit. But your spirit doesn't have to be this airy-fairy supernatural thing.
Can it be electrochemical potentials in my brain?
Yes.
How is that a spirit?
I think your spirit, is basically... Well, we've talked about this, so scientists haven't even figured out yet where our sense of self comes from, our like sense of identity. We know that our brains fire all these different things, but we don't understand where my sense of I and your sense of I comes from.
I don't think we're missing any of the puzzle pieces for the sense of self. I think the puzzle is just very large and complicated, and we know all the pieces and we haven't put them together. And it sounds like... So for me, none of the pieces are particularly spiritual pieces. And I don't think putting them together turns them into something spiritual. So I don't think there's a spiritual thing going on in terms of our sense of self.
But then you're planting some other understanding of spiritual on what I'm saying. Because I'm saying that our sense of self could be our spirit. Like you think for something to be spiritual, for spiritual something to be real, there has to be some extra magical component
Yes,
that goes into it.
I
Even-
agree
Okay.
with this statement. The human spirit. Yeah, means this like magic soul thing that's not made out of atoms and we don't know what it is and it's mysterious. And that's my understanding of what spirit is.
And I think that could be it, And it could also be that all these experiences we have that we explain with spiritual terms are made of atoms and whatever else makes up our physical world that we don't have sensitive enough instruments to measure and don't know exists. And all these things, and it could all just be physical reality.
Yeah, okay, okay. So, I suppose in the past when you've said something like, I think the spirit is this thing, and it might be magic or it might not be, I always assumed that in the it might not be eventuality, you'd stop using the word spirit. But it sounds like you definitely won't.
No, it's still your spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, spirit means the magic option. I have a question related to this.
Yes.
Are there any things that we already understand that you call spiritual?
Oh, that's a good question. I
Because
don't
it
know.
sounds mostly to me like your sense of spiritual is all in the gaps in our understanding.
Energy fuels everything. Can you say that that's somewhat of an accurate statement?
I'll agree with that. Nothing really happens without work, and work takes energy.
Right. For anything we can see or hear or observe to happen requires energy. That energy in that explanation could be God to me. So that means everything is God. Thunder is God. Your blinking that just happened is God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is all, it's just the thing that infuses life and makes everything happen. And so even if it is just energy, if it is just these various kinds of energy that make thunder happen, and when I move something, make the sound happen or move it, I mean, that's still, I almost like that better than some supernatural explanation, because then it's just like so grounded in everything and who we all are. And that the mundane is everything so significant, and it connects absolutely all of us to everything. So yes, the answer is yes,
Answer
because
is yes.
everything is fueled by energy, and ultimately I think that could be the thing. Energy is relatively understood as far as I understand.
In that we have formulas, yes, but I don't think any physicist would tell you they know what it is.
Right.
It's just this number that stays the same.
Sounds like God to me.
Number 2 also stays the same. The things that stay the same are a consequence of symmetry, of the universe here being the same as the universe an hour ago, or the universe here being the same as the universe 10 feet to the left. So they don't seem godlike to me.
Does it bother you that I think about and want to talk about these things?
No, but I still find it difficult to talk about.
Okay.
And
that's
I don't
fair.
spend so much time thinking about any question regarding spirit or God. I thought about them a lot a bunch of years ago, and now I don't. Think about other things, like what cosmology says about the universe and whether or not we're in a simulation. It's like, I don't think I am, and yet if I think about how the universe works, I probably am. Even if I think about how the universe works in different ways, I'm probably in a small bubble no larger than this room in an infinite sea of noise, and that it's going to collapse in a second, and that my entire memory of it is fictitious.
So I love that you think that it's plausible that we are simulations created by something else, but you don't think it's plausible that that something else is a God who created us. Like, those are the exact same statement with different words. And the magic of religious stuff is just some kind of science that we completely don't understand that created our simulation.
Yes, I see how you could look at it this way.
I just find it so mind-boggling that we just had a conversation where you were like, yeah, it's totally not plausible that there's a God. And then you follow that by saying it's totally plausible that we are a simulation.
Yeah, so I don't think we're a simulation. It's just that the number argument is really convincing, and so I feel like there's a contradiction that I'm missing, or a failure in the argument that I'm missing, or we're a simulation, and it's a really good one. Perhaps I need to think further on these thoughts. Yeah, I still have a hard time thinking of God as being a much looser and weaker thing than the way all the religions talk about it.
Well, it's fair. People talk about God a lot in very concrete terms.
Can we just call it the muffin?
The muffin?
Yeah.
Sure.
We can invent a new word that's not an English word already if you like it.
So, Andrea, how did that feel?
Good and weird.
Tell me more.
Well, it's been hard for me in general with this because of my upbringing, I had this really ingrained idea that if you don't have the same spiritual views as someone, you cannot date them. That it's just like fundamentally will never work. And so when my spiritual views started to change, then that part still stayed kind of ingrained. So it's hard for me to talk about this stuff sometimes, even though I don't think that it's going to ruin our relationship. I actually think it can work just fine with the differences that we have. But it feels like a very scary thing to talk about still.
Here's what was interesting to me about the whole thing is that you say that you two have differences, and I think you ended up touching on it a couple times, but I don't think it really landed for either of you. But your differences are merely in terms of vocabulary used. Like, I, as an outside viewer, don't see any difference in the actual theory that you both carry.
I think you're probably right. And it's probably happening sometimes when I don't even realize it, that we're saying the same things. And I'm not listening to what he's saying because he's using words I don't like. And he's not listening to what I'm saying because I'm using words he doesn't like. I don't want to try and push a thing onto him. I think the reason why I do it is that I feel like he's amiable to like listening to me say my things, but at the end of the day, he thinks I'm wrong. And he has told me that in previous conversations. And so I feel like I have to defend my worldview. If he thinks it's wrong, I have to defend it and at least convince him that it's somehow valid. But ultimately, that shouldn't be the point in these conversations. I don't like that being what I'm doing. It just seems to be happening because I get all defensive.
I'd be interested to know what everybody who's listening to the show right now thinks. What do you guys think? Do you think that it is important for people to share worldviews? Or do you guys have any tips and tricks or ways that you deal with being in a relationship with somebody who has completely differing worldviews from you? In this show, it was a religious context, but it doesn't really matter. It could be a political context. It could be anything.
Share your thoughts, share your perspectives, your questions. Tell me whether you think Essex and I are doomed or not. You can email us, liferightpodcast@gmail.com. Visit us on Facebook, facebook.com/liferightpodcast, or just visit our website, www.liferightpodcast.com, where all those things are listed.
So that's our show for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you come again next Monday. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also get the show from our website, liferightpodcast.com, or you can check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/liferightpodcast. See you again next week. Andrea, you got anything else to say?
Yeah. So I heard this joke,
Okay.
and it's perfect for the end of this episode.
Cool.
So there was this guy. It was a girl, and she, maybe it was a duck. I can't remember.
Life, right? Life Right is Joel Grinke and Andrea Lowen. Our theme music is by Matt Grinke, and underscoring this week was by Peter Abando. Life Right is able to be presented without ads and for free thanks to a generous grant from the United Church of Canada. We're produced out of the offices of Lynn Valley United Church in North Vancouver, British Columbia. For more information about their various services and programs, please check out lynnvalleychurch.com. Join us next week for more stories about the things that we all experience but we very rarely talk about. Because, well, life, right?